This podcast is brought to you by the state of North Carolina. If you're looking for a leg up for your business, look no further than North Carolina. There are many reasons that CNBC has ranked it the top state for business. The evolution of its tax code is one of them. Among all states with a corporate tax rate, North Carolina has the lowest. Even better, by 2030, it won't even have one. Now that'll make the neighbors jealous. So if you're all in on better business, it's all in North Carolina. Visit allinnc.com to learn more.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 299, interview with Michel Paradis about his book, Last Mission to Tokyo, the extraordinary story of the Doolittle Raiders and their final fight for justice. Michel Paradis is a leading human rights lawyer and national security law scholar. He has worked on war crimes cases around the globe, including for the Department of Defense on the military commissions in Guantanamo Bay. He is a lecturer at Columbia Law School and a fellow at the Center of National Security. Mr. Paradis, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So, first of all, congratulations on a story that I did not know that was well told. It has elements of World War II, a legal thriller, revenge, cultural differences. That's something I'm always fascinated about. And it raises serious questions about how countries should treat foreign combatants. And I just have to ask, how did you first learn about the Doolittle Raid, and how did this book come about for you?
Sure. Well, the Doolittle Raid goes back to my childhood, going to air shows, and this is dates me back to the 1980s. I was much more interested, to be perfectly frank, in the F-14 Tomcats because Top Gun was out, and that's where my interest lay. But I remember actually seeing what must have been an old B-25, probably not a B-25B, but a B-25, and someone told me that was the first plane that ever attacked Japan during World War II, and I was a little boy at the time. But that certainly stuck with me. I remember this big, sort of fat, glass-nosed plane. And so the Doolittle Raid is always sort of stuck in my mind. It's just an epic moment in World War II history. Mm-hmm. But the finding of the case, actually, and ultimately what this book is about, was totally different and totally random. I was working in the Bush administration, the Department of Defense, back in 2007. Right. And there was an ongoing debate as to whether or not waterboarding constituted torture. And we had heard a rumor that there was a case where the United States prosecuted the Japanese for engaging in waterboarding. Right. And so we sent a young Marine captain out to the National Archives to dig out this record that we were told would shed some light on this question about waterboarding. And lo and behold, it was the trial of the Japanese lawyers, generals, prison wardens who were responsible for murdering and torturing the Doolittle Raiders. And I remember sitting there just reading it with, my eyes agog at what an incredible story it was. And that's how I found the story. And so it brought these two very disparate threads in my life together at the same time.
That's incredible. Yeah, because you're sitting there asking this very important question at a very important time in American history, and then you find out, wait a minute, we were charging or accusing someone of doing the very same thing to our guys. So the irony obviously did not escape you. So you mentioned the Department of Defense. Could you give us a little bit more about your background, please?
Sure. So I've been a practicing lawyer for going on 2 decades, which is it's a little anxiety inducing all by itself. Right. But one of the I've done all sorts of kinds of law. But one of the main areas of my specialization has been war crimes. I've worked in Africa, in Central America, a little bit in the Netherlands, and then on the Guantanamo cases, working on the military commissions to arise out of Guantanamo, which are war crimes prosecutions, much like Nuremberg, much like the story I tell about here, which was a U.S. Army military commission conducted in March and April of 1946 to prosecute the Japanese for war crimes. And something that even most lawyers don't know. Most people know about Nuremberg, obviously, and then a slightly smaller group of people always know that there's a Japanese Nuremberg, the Tokyo trials. But what most Americans and even most lawyers don't know is that there were literally hundreds of war crimes trials that the United States and other allied powers conducted throughout Europe and Asia, prosecuting Germans and Japanese and even Italians for gross violations of international law. And in fact, the United States was the tip of the spear on that. We were one of the leading lights in terms of not only insisting that trials be conducted, but that fair trials be conducted. The Soviets conducted a few trials too.
Right.
I don't know if they've stood up to the test of history in the same way that trials like the Doolittle trial, which I read about, have. And that was a real innovation. There's a probably apocryphal story that Winston Churchill tells about the Tehran conference, where they're discussing for the first time, what do we do with the Nazis after the war?
Right.
And he tells this story of Joseph Stalin proposing to just execute the top 50,000 Nazis.
Sure.
Just make a hit list, essentially. And Churchill, says in his memoirs, I was aghast at such a thing. But the truth, and this came out, there have been rumors about this starting in the 1990s, but some journals were published only in the past 5-6 years of members of Churchill's staff, where Churchill was actually on board with that. 50,000 was too much, and in fact, Roosevelt is supposedly to have said, well, wouldn't 49,000 be enough?
A compromise, yeah.
A compromise, yeah. But Churchill, up until the very end of the war, right, even at the Yalta conference, was advocating to essentially create a hit list of a few hundred Nazis to just have them be executed on sight or on identification. And Roosevelt pushed against that. He said, no, we have to have fair trials. We not only need to win the war, we need to win the peace. And the way to do that was to make American values, things like due process, things like fair trials, things like human rights, which were not universal values in 1945.
Right.
Part of international law, part of the way the world will be from then on. And so it's actually one of the great legacies of World War II is this how we treat our enemies, and the standards that we use to ensure not only that that revenge, to not only satiate our desires for revenge, but to also see that justice is done in a way that will stand up to the test of history.
So you make a compelling point because, one, the desire for revenge is obviously something that humans readily understand and give into at times. And the other thing is, you're right, I mean, you can't just take, say, whether it's 10 or 50,000 people and line them up without a trial, because if you're no better than the Nazis, you're no better than the Japanese that you're now trying. So again, it's this complex, I guess, battle between emotions, between the desire for revenge, but also one, you want to do it properly. But I've got to think at the time, the Americans we're thinking, look, whatever we do now could reverberate down the years because we are the sole remaining superpower. So I do applaud those people who are like, as much as I want to line these people up and shoot them, we do have to observe the laws because at some point, maybe some of our boys will be caught by the enemy, and we have to think about that as well.
Yeah, and that's really what my book is about. Mm-hmm. It's the so everyone certainly anyone listening to this podcast knows about the Doolittle raid. Mm-hmm. But what is far less talked about, or only ends up being maybe a section of a chapter, and even the great studies of the Doolittle raid that have been written, are the fate of the 8 Doolittle raiders who actually get captured. Right, 69 ultimately make it to freedom and get home. 3 are killed in the operation, right. But 8 are captured by the Japanese, subjected to incredibly brutal torture, including waterboarding, including sleep deprivation, including being hung by the hands, stress positions, like having a bamboo pole put behind your knees as they stomp away at your thighs to essentially wrench apart your knee joints. This is some grisly stuff.
Right.
And the treatment of the Doolittle raiders by the Japanese was motivated by revenge. Mm-hmm. Right? These were the first Americans to ever attack Japan. These were the first foreigners to ever really successfully attack Japan, right. The mainland of Japan. And So the idea that, these people deserved any rights was seen as soft, right? And the Japanese just wanted to do whatever they could to them. And in fact, there were factions in the Japanese cabinet, particularly Hajime Sugiyama, who was the army chief of staff, who proposed, now that we've caught these 8 guys, let's just behead them, right? Let's just execute them as publicly as possible to deter any other Americans from ever trying something like this again, because, we need to send a message: don't attack Japan. And what was remarkable to me, right? So I confess, just coming at this with maybe a naive understanding of the Pacific War, that's actually far more common, having now written this book, than I think people than I even recognized.
Right.
I just assumed, well, yeah, like that's of course what they would do. It's the Japanese. Like, look at the rape of Nanking.
Right.
But what really fascinated me and really was troubling in some ways, I'll be perfectly honest, it was troubling, was how seriously people in the Japanese government took the rule of law, international law, even things like human rights. And it opened Japan up to me, or at least wartime Japan up to me, in a way that was, in a way, kind of troubling, because unlike Nazi Germany or unlike fascist Italy, where you have these charismatic leaders who, once they're removed from power, they're no longer participants in the war. My counterpart for that in Japan, I'm sure most people's, is Tojo, right?
Right.
But Tojo was removed from power in 1944, and Japan continues to fight the war as aggressively and as brutally as it had for the previous 4 years. And what that betrayed is that Japan, in the wartime Japan, was essentially a liberal country in the 1920s. They were the first country to ever sign the Geneva Conventions of 1929.
Right.
But they had, through a combination of political fractiousness and a couple of attempted coups, and some just really, bad policy making, to say the least,
Right.
Had become this deeply divided society, this deeply divided government between two very different versions of what Japan should be. On the one hand, you had this basically racist, fascist ideology, but almost in equipoise in terms of their, political power, were people who were kind of part of what had been a 100-year tradition almost at that point of Japan being a modern liberal society in the same way as the United Kingdom or even the United States would be. Right. People forget that in Japan's war with Russia at the turn of the 20th century, Japan actually had a better reputation for the treatment of prisoners than Russia did.
Wow.
And was praised for that, right? Japan was on the side of the Allies during World War I. Its change, its lurch towards this kind of fascist and imperialist ideology was somewhat abrupt. And so why did they go to the trouble of actually putting the Doolittle raiders on trial? This was a puzzle to me. Why didn't they just behead them? And it turned out that these irreconcilable factions inside the Japanese government, with liberals like Foreign Minister Togo, pitted against fascists like Hajime Sugiyama, essentially were forced to come to a compromise by Tojo. Tojo was this sort of hapless. I sometimes analogize him to John Boehner, right? This kind of this leader who's just trying to keep everyone from killing each other. Has very little in terms of political credibility of his own to be able to lead. And basically, what Tojo does is he goes to lawyers in the War Ministry, Japan's War Ministry, and says, we need to find a legal way of executing the Doolittle raiders. And the lawyers, the Japanese lawyers, and this was an amazing find that I almost stumbled upon in the National Archives. It was literally in a box marked SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allies in the Pacific,
right.
Miscellaneous, right? So it's the classic sort of just large blank box in the National Archives. And I found that the Japanese lawyers in the War Ministry, their initial answer was, no, you can't. You can't execute them. It's illegal. Yeah. And the message was sent back down to them. That's not the right answer. We need to find a legal way to execute them, because otherwise the Kempei Tai, which is the sort of clandestine service secret police who's torturing the Doolittle raiders as all this is going on, they're just going to kill them anyway and make it look like an accident or claim it's an accident.
Right.
And that's going to be completely politically unacceptable, both internally for our own, because of our own divisions, but also diplomatically, right? There are hundreds of thousands of Japanese at this point being held in internment camps inside the United States. And so they're worried that this is going to set a bad precedent. And so what the kind of over-clever lawyers in the War Ministry ultimately come up with is this idea, well, if we come up with military commissions, if we come up with essentially a war crimes tribunal for the Doolittle raiders, we can accuse them of atrocities against the Japanese, we can try them, and we can execute them. And that's what they do. And they pass an ex post facto law. The law is written, only non-Japanese can be prosecuted. And then they conduct this trial in August of 1942, relying on evidence derived from torture to convict the Doolittle raiders of atrocities. They're all sentenced to death. And the emperor ultimately commutes the sentence of 5 of them. 3 are executed in October of 1942, and 5 are sentenced to essentially hard labor, what we would call hard labor, what the Japanese called special treatment. Right. And 1 dies of malnutrition. The 4 barely survive, but are sort of miraculously liberated in August of 1945.
Wow. Let me react to that real quick, because you said something a minute ago when you were saying that let's just kill them, make it as public as possible to teach the Americans, if you try something like this again, this will happen again and again to your flyers. That was, if you zoom out from that idea for a second, that was pretty much the Japanese plan for the war in the Pacific. We're going to sucker punch the Americans. We're going to take out their fleet. We're going to grab a whole bunch of territory that we need for resources. And then as the Americans come, we will make them trying to retake that territory so costly when it comes to lives. They will be, because Americans are weak and soft, they will be forced to come to the negotiating table. We'll talk. We'll get to keep some of the land that we've grabbed, and we can end this war. I mean, it wasn't so much this is guaranteed to work. They're like, this is the best chance that we have to end this war. But again, the premise was the Americans are soft. So again, They just didn't have a sense of, I mean, Americans, let's be honest, we love our creature comforts. We certainly love a steady paycheck and easy life. But if you piss us off, the other part of the American character comes out that just doesn't want to quit. And we genuinely felt like we were wronged at Pearl Harbor. They bombed. There wasn't a declaration of war. So when you bring in the American sense of fair play and that's violated, we get pretty testy at that point.
Yeah, I don't know what I'll refrain from swearing, but we'll F you up.
That's right.
Right, like that.
Yeah, it was revenge, because again we saw ourselves as being sucker punched. Okay, so let's back up and let's set up the story. So Pearl Harbor comes along. It was brilliantly executed. They messed up the whole political timeline with declaring war. I've already covered that. But America literally sees itself as being sucker punched. So we're pretty pissed at this point. Now FDR, the consummate politician, knows that he not only needs to do something to teach the Japanese a lesson in the short term, but he also needs to give something to the American people, to give them hope, to say, yes, they did this to us, but this is just round 1. We are just getting started, and we are not afraid to face the Japanese warriors who were seen as superhuman. They were seen as supermen. So how does the Special Aviation Project Number 1, which I totally love that name, how does that come about?
Yeah, so right, and that's not even the half of it, right? It's not only that we can strike back against Japan. The war is going terribly in the first half of 1942, right? Africa campaign is not going well. The Japan is on the march throughout Asia. The Bataan Death March is underway. We've lost the Philippines, which is our largest colony. Germany is on the march in Operation Barbarossa. Right. This is the darkest days of this war for the United States. Yes. And so what they end up doing is, an idea comes up. Can we take Army bombers off an aircraft carrier to attack Japan? And it's a kind of a ludicrous idea because you can't, right? It's actually in 1942, it's impossible. It's actually impossible. Yet the idea is passed along to a lieutenant colonel by the name of Jimmy Doolittle, who is a stunt pilot. He had served briefly in the Air Force in the late around World War I. Thankfully, saw no action because he almost certainly would have been killed, as most pilots during World War I were. And then goes on, gets his PhD in aeronautical engineering, what we would call aeronautical engineering, from MIT. He becomes a celebrity stunt pilot, and he builds this reputation up for doing the impossible. So he's the first person to ever cross the United States in 24 hours.
Wow.
Right, and that's and like. Now we think, oh my God, 24 hours, right? We can get to California in five hours, maybe, or 6 hours. But think about the world shifting, like how much that would just shift your sense of space and time in the 1930s, right? Prior to that, the fastest way to get anywhere would be like a train, or cars, right? Speed limit on most highways at the time was in the 35, 45 miles an hour range. And so the idea that you could get from San Francisco to New York as quickly as you could get from, New York to Philadelphia was just it completely changes your sense of what America is, right? America is a much more intimate place. And so that's where Jimmy Doolittle makes his name. And he does all these other things that make him look crazy, actually, insane. One of the things he's most famous for is he blacked out the windshield on his airplane, took off, flew 14 miles in a circle overhead, and then landed his plane in Long Island without ever being able to see a foot in front of him. And it's totally insane, right? It sounds totally insane.
Right.
But what Jimmy but the trick, and this was sort of the amazing thing just to read about, he really should be much more of a household name than he is, because he's such an amazing and such an American figure, is that he was not like most flyboys of this era are kind of the Howard Hughes type, right? They're riding these planes like horses. It's all from the gut. And Jimmy Doolittle understands at an early in his flight career that once you're up in the air, your sense of up, down, space, it's completely different. Human beings are not meant to fly through the air.
Right.
And so he realizes that in order to fly safely, you have to use math, right? You have to use instrumentation. You have to stop relying on your gut. You have to think your way. You have to calculate your way through the problems of aviation. And that's why he gets his PhD. And this blind flying stunt was, not to show how he was insane. It was to show you could actually fly a plane solely based on the instrumentation, solely based on, what the numbers tell you. Right. And so when he's given this impossible mission of how do we attack Japan in 1942, he is the perfect person to solve that problem, not because he's fearless, although he is. It's because he knows he has to make the numbers add up. And he just treats it as this really difficult, at the time, again, impossible engineering problem, where he just re-engineers the B-25 to turn them into flying gas cans. And comes up with all sorts of finesse techniques to get a plane, for example, turning the aircraft carrier into the wind so you get a headwind right away, so that you can get off an aircraft carrier in a plane that's designed to take off on a runway that's like 3-4 times as long as the deck of an aircraft carrier. Wow. And so, it's just this utterly amazing, feat, not only of courage, and that's not to gainsay the courage. The courage is insane, right? No, the idea that he can do this is crazy. But just of engineering, right? The ingenuity behind it, the same kind of like American ingenuity that leads to the light bulb in the iPhone, right? Is the kind of ingenuity that leads to the Doolittle raid, and it's just a remarkable feat, and so he does it, right? He gets 16 Army planes, Army bombers, B-25s, off of an aircraft carrier on what was understood at the time to be a one-way mission over Japan, and they were just hoping for the best. They end up having to take off half a day early because they're spotted by some Japanese picket boats, and that's not just losing the element of surprise and now having to fly over in daylight. Right. Your range. He's now hundreds of nautical miles further away, not only from Japan but from China, where they're hoping to land. So, it's an incredibly improbable mission from the very beginning, and he pulls it off, which is why he becomes really one of the most celebrated heroes of the entire war.
Right.
And certainly should be a household name today in ways that he unfortunately is no longer.
You're absolutely right. I have to be honest with you. When I got to this part of your book and I read about Jimmy Doolittle, he's got the courage and the strength of Tarzan. He's a Einstein. He can do all these things. I was expecting a 28-year-old or something like this. Is he in his 40s at this point?
Yeah, he's almost 50.
Yeah. That's not fair. I mean, this guy can do everything, and he's my age, or he's actually a little younger than me. But oh my God, I mean, he's just a man's man. And so you take him, and then you take these.
And on top of it, I should just add this one other feature, because so he's been depicted in at least 3 films, like feature films, and he's gotten some pretty generous casting, right? like Alec Baldwin, like square-jawed, tall, like Aaron Eckhart was in Midway most recently.
Good point.
And the real Jimmy Doolittle is like 5'8", bald, not in best shape, right? Like Paul Giamatti or Jason Alexander would have been a much more true to life casting.
So you're saying I could play Jimmy Doolittle in the next World War II film?
You would be the most accurate depiction of any World War II movie.
But you can't discount his courage, and like you just said a second ago. When he flies in the plane with the windows blacked out, is that courage? Yes, that's courage, but it's also relying on mathematics and science and other stuff. So he certainly is a brainy cove, and that shouldn't be lost. But when he gathers his crews, who I guess they're mostly in their 20s, I'll let you tell me, but to tell a 20 or something year old who may be married, who may be, either way, they're just starting life, look, we're going on a one-way mission. I don't know if you're going to survive. We have a plan for you to survive, but let's be honest. I mean, how reliable is that? That's a whole nother level of courage for those guys to go, there's a decent chance I won't make it back. I'll become a prisoner. And we've all heard stories about the Japanese, but I volunteer for this mission. I mean, that is absolutely incredible.
Oh yeah. And the way it's pitched, and this is sort of I tried to put myself back in my 20-year-old mind in thinking about how I would hear this. But initially, none of them know what they're doing, right? Jimmy Doolittle basically puts out and he calls out, "I'd like volunteers for a dangerous mission."
Yeah, my 20s. Yeah.
I'm in my 20s, maybe I'm like, hey, I'm immortal.
I can do it.
I can do that. And that's what's actually kind of a crazy aspect of this whole thing, is that he trains up all these crews, about 120 men in all, in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and they don't get told what they're doing. They're just taking off of a runway. They keep being told, we have to get the plane off in 500 feet. Like, that's the only thing you need to be able to do is get the plane off in 500 feet. And so they're drilling on this for like a month. And ultimately, he flies everybody out. They're as good as they're going to be. He flies them all out to Alameda, California. And they see all these planes being, dropped onto the deck of an aircraft carrier. Pieces start coming together. Okay, we're in the Pacific. We're putting these Army bombers on an aircraft carrier. But it's not until 2 days into the voyage on this aircraft carrier that over the loudspeaker they announce, this task force is headed for Tokyo. And everyone all of a sudden just loses their mind, right? Here we are, finally, in April 1942. We're taking the fight back to the Japanese. We're getting our peace for Pearl Harbor. And so it's just an electrifying moment. And it's then that they start going through briefings on what exactly it is they're going to be doing and how they're going to plan to do this bombing raid on Tokyo.
I just have to say, like you were saying a second ago, in my 20s, you could talk me into something like that. But I have to think that the desire for revenge was one of the strong motivating factors. Yeah, we're finally going to give back to those guys who sucker punched us at Pearl Harbor. I mean, that had to be a part of it too. And I'm not judging the Americans, because that's a very natural thing. I mean, the idea to be able to strike back at these people who, we lost thousands of people at Pearl Harbor. It's time for a little payback. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And what was interesting in unpacking some of this is, certainly natural, certainly understandable. Everyone can sympathize with that idea. Yeah. And the pilots, when they were doing the target selection, the pilots actually drew cards to see who would get to bomb the Imperial Palace, right? Wow. They wanted to punch Japan back in the nose at least as hard as they had punched us at Pearl Harbor. And Jimmy Doolittle put a stop to it. Right, he came in and said, "No, we're not attacking the Imperial Palace. That is not a military target. We're going to be attacking airplane factories. We're going to be attacking oil refineries. We're going to be attacking other factories that are there because it's our objective." And this came out of the Air Force Tactical School, that he was the so-called bomber mafia, that he was an acolyte of. The way to win a war with air power is to take out the enemy's ability to wage war, right? So you go after factories, you go after the military targets like military bases and airports, but you leave the civilians alone. And that's not only important because it's the right thing to do, and that can't be emphasized enough, right? Like taking the civilians out of the equation was part of American policy at the time because it is the right thing to do. We have human rights. We have the sense of the dignity of every person. Right. But it's also bad strategically. Let's just be honest, right? And Jimmy Doolittle says this quite frankly, right? He was looking in figuring out how to conduct the raid. He took a model from the European theater, which was going on, right? He looked at the Battle of Britain, and he understood that as the Germans were taking out, the electrical power, they were taking out the docks, they were taking out, the various factories and means of sort of daily life and war material in London, morale in England was sinking and sinking and sinking. And it wasn't until the Germans started attacking the Buckingham Palace that the Brits were sort of able to rally. And, they were like, if the king can take it, so can I. Wow. And he understood that. That was at the front of his mind. If you go to his planning, the memos he's writing as he's planning this mission, and so he's like, no, we can't give the Japanese a reason to rally. This has to be a show of our force, of our values, and the fact that we're going to win this war and take out their ability to ever do anything like Pearl Harbor ever again.
This podcast is brought to you by the state of North Carolina. If you're looking for a leg up for your business, look no further than North Carolina. There are many reasons that CNBC has ranked it the top state for business. The evolution of its tax code is one of them. Among all states with a corporate tax rate, North Carolina has the lowest. Even better, by 2030, it won't even have one. Now that'll make the neighbors jealous. So if you're all in on better business, it's all in North Carolina. Visit allinnc.com to learn more.
Absolutely. Now, I'm glad you brought that up because Doolittle can only take so many planes. Those planes have only so many bombs. There's only so much damage they could do. But yeah, you do want to strike military targets because that's what's best for the war effort. And it's also what's best as far as the way you treat fellow human beings. So he certainly should be admired for that. Could you introduce us to Chase Nielsen, who is pivotal in your book and the story overall, and then maybe give us some of the details of the raid itself?
Sure. So Chase Nielsen is a good Mormon boy from Hiram, Utah, a small town in Utah. Right. Actually ends up he's scheduled to get married I think it was actually December 8th of 1941. Right. And obviously Pearl Harbor changed a couple things. And so he ends up getting deployed up in Oregon. And his fiance ends up coming up to Oregon to elope with him. Right. So he actually ends up getting married in December of 1941. He is one of the young men who is just as unable to resist the allure of a dangerous mission as all the others. Right. But it's complicated for him, right? He's leaving a wife. He's leaving his wife, which is not something most of the other Doolittle raiders. There were other married Doolittle raiders like Ted Lawson, who was the author of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. But he was a rarity in that respect. These are young men. Right. And he gets he takes the assignment. He gets assigned as the navigator on plane number 6. He's got a real good head for numbers, just like Doolittle in some ways. And he navigates the plane successfully over Tokyo. They attack their targets. But as they're flying to what they hope is a rendezvous point inside of China, right. The plane starts running out of gas. And the pilot of the plane, a Texas football player by the name of Jungle Jim Hallmark, says, everyone put your Mae Wests on. We're about to hit the water. So they put and they just crash. They crash hard off the Chinese coast. Two of the bombardier and the gunner are basically both killed in the crash. They survive the immediate crash but die within a few minutes of their wounds. Nielsen, the pilot and co-pilot, in the middle, this is at nighttime. This is in the dark. It's in the rain.
Wow.
It's cold. It's still April. End up floating to shore and are rescued by some locals in China in a little town called Juxi, which is about a few hundred miles south of Shanghai. Mm-hmm. They're taken in. They are looking for ways to try and get to safety, to get further inland to where American allied Chinese forces may be. They come across some Chinese guerrillas, I should say, come across them.
Right.
When they come into Juxi. They think everything's going to be fine, and then all of a sudden get handed over to the Japanese army.
Oh.
And the Japanese lieutenant in charge says, "No worry, we treat you fine." And at first that was true.
Right.
They get taken up on a caravan. They're not treated too bad as they're taken up to Shanghai. But once they get to Shanghai, they fall into the hands of the Kempe Tai, who I mentioned earlier are basically Japan's clandestine service, secret police. I could talk to you for hours about them. They're a sort of a horrifying entity that has a notorious reputation among the Japanese. Right, the Japanese are terrified and hate the Kempe Tai, and he's just brutally tortured for an entire day. At one point, they take these thin little sticks. It's the one that just sends chills down my spine. So I'll tell you about it. Right. They're just brutalizing him in ways I talked about before. But then at one point, they pin his hand down to the table, and they take out these tiny little sticks that look like thin pencils, and then just pierce them between the webbing of his fingers down into the nerves of his fingers.
God.
And just start squeezing his hand and twisting the pencils. And the way he describes it is just jaw clenching. Like you just goes right through you. The kind of just sharp, unignorable pain that would cause.
Yeah.
He's beaten. He spends the night hung from his hands in a prison cell until he's taken to Tokyo, into a secret prison that the Kempe Tai sets up inside of Tokyo, in which to hold them. He, along with the 7 other Doolittle raiders who get captured, are interrogated aggressively. They're forced to confess to atrocities against the Japanese.
Can I ask real quick, as far as you could tell, because I'm not sure how much of this has been cleared up or whatever, do we know if the Doolittle raiders pretty much was able to stay on target as far as their objectives? I imagine they were cloud cover or whatever, but do we know if they did a decent job as far as what Doolittle wanted them to go after?
So it's difficult to know, I think, is the basic answer.
Right.
All the Doolittle raiders, report hitting their targets, but I think just confirmation bias, everyone's going to say, yeah, I hit my target.
Right on.
Some scholars associated with the Japanese Defense Forces about 15, 20 years ago did a pretty in-depth study trying to use as many U.S. records and Japanese records as possible to trace flight paths, identify targets. And there was actually a fair bit of accuracy. Some of the places that were hit were, in fact, factories, but they may have, they weren't necessarily the factories they were probably assigned. Like one was a clothing factory.
Right.
Not a steel mill, for example. But things like steel mills or the Kawasaki plant were actually hit. And that was, those were the intended targets. Same thing was true in Nagoya. The things got a little dicier, and I think we got to be frank about this, particularly with the use of incendiary bombs.
Sure.
All of the Doolittle raiders were equipped both with demolition bombs, right? Sort of just traditional 500-pound gravity bombs, but also incendiary bomb clusters. And the basic fact, if we're honest, about an incendiary bomb is you can't drop an incendiary bomb accurately, right? They're basically the size of a baseball.
Right.
Once they get released, it's basically it's the equivalent of a shotgun.
Right.
And Japan is made of wood in the early 1940s, and so it was pretty inflammable. And so a lot of the incendiary bombing ended up doing some damage. It's not that much bombing. Let's be perfectly frank about that too. You're only dealing with 16 planes, but there was some significant incendiary bomb damage to civilian targets in Tokyo suburbs, especially.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up because, there's always going to be collateral damage. But see, that's one of the things I enjoyed about your book. The irony never escaped me. We are at war I'm bombing you. I'm trying not to bomb your civilians. I'm trying to bomb military targets, but the civilians are helping with the war effort. So it's this murky, it's this morass that I to this day still have a hard time, because I think it was Churchill that said we bomb the factories, but we also bomb the civilians because they're the ones working in the factories. So it gets really ugly really quick. But the reason I bring that up is because when people like Chase Nielsen and the other pilots, I'm assuming the majority of the pilots eventually made it to free China or were helped, whatever. And you can tell me about that in a moment. But are they being asked questions while they're being tortured, or is it simply just, hey, you bombed our homeland and now we're going to make you suffer?
A little of both. Let's be perfectly candid.
Right.
That's typically what we see in when torture is being used.
Mm-hmm.
There's some desire to get information. Probably more desire to get what's called confirmation as opposed to information. Right. Like you bombed civilians, didn't you?
Gotcha.
Torture. Yes, I did. Right. That's sort of the traditional way in which not only torture is used, but also really the only way that torture is proven to be effective.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you're trying to get reliable information out of somebody, torturing them is actually a pretty bad way of doing it. Not only because they'll tell you whatever you want to hear, and that's basically true. But just if you're getting someone to try and remember something, putting them under extreme stress and pain is not a good way to help someone think through what can sometimes be murky or difficult things to remember in a clear way. And it can actually be very destructive of your ability to get reliable information. But if you're only trying to get something from the horse's mouth, beat the horse, because the horse will tell you what you want to hear.
Absolutely.
And so, when we look at the Soviets and in Korea, U.S. POWs being tortured by the North Koreans and Chinese, that's where torture is really effective. It's to get these kind of false confessions to what you want to hear. And so that was some of it. That was a lot of the torture. They were also very interested. The Japanese were very interested in getting the details of the raid itself. Right. Mm-hmm. One of the things everyone forgets in looking back is kind of what I said earlier on is in 1942 what they did was impossible. Right. No one knew how that actually happened. And so Roosevelt put out the word very fast. Mum is the word. And if the news media asks where the bombers took off, first of all, to deny that they're American bombers, or at least don't mention it. Right. And speculate that they took off from Shangri-La. Right. That's where this sort of joke comes from. Right. Is this magic Himalayan paradise where we're sending army bombers. And so for months, there was a lot of speculation in the press about how exactly this attack on Japan took off. Were they taking off from secret bases inside China? Were they taking off with new bombers from elsewhere and over the Himalayas in the China-Burma-India theater? Were the Soviets secretly involved? Did we still have positions in the Philippines? Right? There are any number of possibilities at this point. And so the idea that bombers could take off like that from an aircraft carrier and go that kind of distance was, again, just technically impossible. Right. And so one of the things the Japanese were very, insistent about or interested in was figuring out exactly how it happened. And this idea that Japan was vulnerable to carrier-based attacks ends up being, a kind of a bugaboo in Japanese war strategy, because it leads them to make terrible decisions, such as committing to and then hastening the attack on Midway, which is directly traceable to the Doolittle raid and end up being catastrophic for Japan's ability to ever really mount an offensive operation in the Pacific again. They lose 4 aircraft carriers.
Wow.
So torture can lead you down some pretty dangerous paths. And the Doolittle raid is certainly a sign of that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a part of your book I want to talk about, but I don't want to give too much away, because this is where we get into the meat of your story. So clearly these American, I think you said there's 7 or 8 of them, the American pilots, they have to be tried, and you already said earlier, do we try them? Do we execute them? And your book really helped me understand that the court system, the lawyers in Japan were fiercely independent. It's just that the military was in charge of the darn government, so there's only so much the legal profession can do, but they do insist upon a trial. So, okay, we have to have a trial, but these are just soldiers, and this is war, so they were pretty much doing their job. So, but still, the Japanese have to come up with a way. We have to be able to find a way to justify killing them, and so there is going to be a trial. Could you tell us some about, and I think you mentioned some of it previously, but they are pretty much bending the rules. Legal rules are also almost bending common sense to be able to find some way to charge these guys. And between the torture and the lack of things being interpreted, a lot of the American pilots don't even know they don't know the details of what's going on.
Yeah, it's it's the quintessential, Alice in Wonderland, sentence first, judgment later, where the Japanese have an outcome they know they need to get to. They need to get to a sentence of guilt and sentence of death, or a conviction of guilt and a sentence of death.
Right.
And they're one of the villainous characters, without getting into spoilers, because I think some of the things that sort of come up in the American trial in 1946 are just so stunning and interesting that I don't want to spoil it for readers.
Sure.
But there is kind of what can only be called a conspiracy led by one Japanese lawyer in particular who kind of masterminds the whole show trial. And he's like, okay, we have to get convictions. We have this ex post facto law that the War Ministry has given us that's probably illegal, but we can probably fudge some arguments for why it's not.
Right.
And then he looks at the evidence and he's like, look, I need more evidence. I need evidence that proves them guilty of atrocities. And he basically puts that back to the Kempei Tai, and the Kempei Tai, sure enough, comes back with evidence, including, the confessions by the Doolittle Raiders that were allegedly personally signed by each man to committing atrocities against the Japanese. And there's an old Soviet expression, the queen. The confession is the queen of all evidence.
Right.
And so they have these confessions of the Doolittle Raiders that are sort of almost comically self-incriminating, right? Where the Doolittle Raiders are clearly at best being, if they're authentic at all, they're being, pretty carefully coached onto exactly what they're being expected to say under torture. And those confessions are admitted at their trial. The trial itself lasts maybe an hour.
Wow.
Only one lawyer is assigned to be one of the judges, and he is essentially part of this conspiracy. His name is Yusei Waco. Right. He's not the leader of the conspiracy, but he's certainly a central part of it. He knows what the score is, as we used to say.
Right.
And they have this hour-long trial. Very little is translated competently. They're barely given notice of what they're accused of. They're not given the right to call their own witnesses. They're not given lawyers to defend them. One of the Doolittle Raiders, the Jungle Jim Hallmark, who I mentioned before, this big, thick-necked Texan football player, who's like 220 pounds at the start of the war, has withered down to like 140 pounds because he has what's probably dysentery that he got in Japanese custody. He's barely conscious, laying on the floor. Flies are buzzing over his face in the August heat. And he's put on trial too, right? And he's convicted too.
Jesus.
It's the classic show trial where everyone knows what the outcome is. We're just going through the formalities of it to make sure we all get to the death sentence that everyone knows is coming. And that's what they get. Right. They within that afternoon, in fact, the Japanese judges go and deliberate, and that afternoon convict all of them and sentence them all to death. Which I should say, just as a footnote, the enemy airman's law, which is this ex post facto law the Japanese army promulgates to prosecute the Doolittle Raiders, initially said that the punishment could be up to the punishment of death for any offense, and that's the first draft that's sent out. But there's concern that the death sentence might not be imposed, and so they revise it right before they promulgate it. They revise the law to say the only sentence that can be imposed is death.
Oh my
right,
God.
So they guarantee the death sentence,
right.
And so sure enough, they get the death sentence they're all asking for, and this goes back to the Japanese cabinet in Tokyo.
Right.
But by this point, right, this is September of 1942, and the war has taken a turn. Right, you've already had the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japan has this disastrous defeat at Midway. A couple of the other major strategic changes that Japan makes in response to the Doolittle raid are it starts pulling back its Air Force. I think I want to say it's like 4 or 5 of Japan's 36 fighter squadrons are immediately redeployed back to the mainland as home defense because, the Army just had done a terrible job of defending Japan. Right?
Yes.
The Doolittle raiders all get through unscathed. And so they redeploy a lot of their air power to the mainland, which essentially forfeits air superiority throughout the Pacific, and is a disastrous strategic mistake, or operational mistake, I guess. And same thing with their China strategy. By the middle of 1942, Japan has basically pacified most of China. There's still pockets of China that are under the control of Chiang Kai-shek or warlords who are allied with Chiang Kai-shek and therefore the United States. Mao and the People's Liberation Army are still, operating in certain parts of China. Right. But certainly the major cities have been completely pacified by the Japanese by the middle of 1942. And the Doolittle raid, because the Doolittle raiders essentially crash land in China, and 69 of them get to safety by hooking up with Chiang Kai-shek's forces in Free China. The Japanese just go on a total campaign of maniacal blind revenge, right? And just do it's always difficult dealing with war casualties is always difficult as a precise historical matter. But there are credible estimates that tens of thousands, as many maybe as 50,000 Chinese are killed in a operation that is conducted after the Doolittle raid, where China redeploys the Japanese completely redeploy the China Expeditionary Army's forces to simply destroy every airfield in China. And not only is this a huge waste of resources in what had been, again, from a strategic standpoint, a largely successful pacification, or what we might call a counterinsurgency operation in China, completely alienates the Chinese, as you might expect.
Right.
It's not only just brutal and sadistic; it actually destabilizes China. And all of a sudden, it hardens the opposition to the Japanese, which was by no means hardened in 1942. Right, most of China, or at least significant parts of China, are governed by Wang Jingwei, who is for the quote unquote Republic of China, who is allied with Japan. Much like Vichy France was allied with Nazi Germany. And the combination of moral and security authority that the Japanese and Wang Jingwei had been building up to that point in parts of China that kept it under control were forfeited just because of this stupid operation to destroy all these airfields. And so it was a total disaster in sort of Japan's strategy.
Well, and because originally when they go to China, it's for money and resources. Hey, we want to be the dominant country in this region. We want everybody to give their stuff to us. We want to be an economic power. That's what you do. And now all of that is being destabilized by their own actions and their thirst for revenge. So it's basically starting to fall apart for the Japanese. So in September,
when the verdict comes back to the cabinet, Japan's position in the war is so much more vulnerable than it had been even a few months before. And so another debate breaks out where Sugiyama again says, well, we got the convictions. Let's all execute them like we planned. Right. But Tojo, surprisingly, ends up being, the voice of, not necessarily reason, but sort of moderation.
Sure.
And proposes a compromise where only the pilots and one of the gunners are going to be ultimately sentenced to death, and persuades Sugiyama to go in for a compromise where the emperor commutes the sentence of the 5 others to this life with special treatment that I mentioned before.
Right. So the point I want everybody to remember is that there's still some prisoners who are alive because some of them are executed, and I want to save that for the readers of the book. And correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as America itself knows, we don't know that several of their sentences had been commuted. We assumed, or we believed, they were all executed.
That's right. So in October of 1942, the Japanese announced that the Doolittle raiders have been punished. And there's a lot of diplomatic correspondence back and forth between the United States and Japan saying, what does that mean?
Right.
And the Japanese basically play coy. And by, the first anniversary of the Doolittle raid in 1943, the reasonable assumption based on what Japan had said is that they were all murdered. They were all executed.
Yes.
And this hits the public, Roosevelt, as you said at the beginning, great politician, probably one of our best best presidents in all of our history, in part because he was such a great politician. And he released the information about the Doolittle raiders being executed at the same time as on the first anniversary of the Doolittle raid. So where they released for the first time the full details of how the raid was pulled off. And it was a really galvanizing moment inside the United States. Like, it really rekindled what had been kind of a flagging wartime spirit, right? By 1943, the war is going better, but it's a slog. And Roosevelt knows he needs to keep the country engaged. Like the fever for revenge and to commit to this war that had existed after Pearl Harbor was cooling, and this re-galvanizes public support for the war in a big way. But what's actually, and if you don't mind a slight digression, maybe this is me as a lawyer finding this stuff fascinating. So I hope hopefully your listeners do too.
Okay.
But what I found fascinating about this particular moment too is, there had certainly been discussions about war crimes prosecutions before this all is revealed in April of 1943. There had been largely sort of generalities about, we will hold people accountable. We will start starting in like late 1942. There's this idea we're going to start tracking the war crimes being committed by the Axis powers. Right. But not unlike what Churchill and Stalin's reactions were at the Tehran conference, which is at the end of 1943. If we remember, is the American public wants to commit just gross, not all the American public, but there's a public outcry for violent revenge against the Japanese, to avenge the Doolittle raiders. You have members of Congress saying, let's just start executing all of the Japanese prisoners. And Roosevelt and Secretary of War Stimson say, no, we're not going to do that. Right. We're going, we have committed to the Geneva Conventions. We have committed to human rights. We will get justice for those responsible. But the rest of Japan, we are not at war with Japan's people. We are at war with their militarists. And it's the first real substantive, like meaningful inkling that we're not going to kind of do what Julius Caesar did to Gaul, right? Like, we're not, or to Carthage, right? Or to, after the war, like we're different. And that was just a really remarkable thing, right? He quite, knowingly fomented this public outrage at what the Japanese had done, to the point where Hollywood actually makes a movie the year later called The Purple Heart that imagines the show trial and execution of the Doolittle raiders, and imagines a trial that's a lot more fair than the one that happened in real life, to be honest with you. Right. But he takes this moment to say, we are better than that. Yes. And in fact, when that movie called The Purple Heart the script was being reviewed by the wartime censors for the Hollywood scripts, the comment they got back was they wanted to de-emphasize the responsibility of the Japanese people and to emphasize that it was the warlords of Japan who were responsible for this atrocity, not because that's who we were at war with. We weren't at the war with the civilians, the people of Japan. And so it's this really, again, it's easy to take that kind of humanitarianism for granted because we've all grown up in the legacy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Like that's all just part of the water we've all been swimming in for certainly my lifetime. Right. But to see that far ahead in 1943, there weren't a lot of historical precedents for that. Quite the opposite. The historical precedents all pointed, to severity, to vindicating revenge, the desire for revenge, if nothing else. Right. So the fact that people like FDR, had that foresight, had that commitment to really core American values is just it's worth taking a moment to just stop and realize what an amazing innovation that was that we the United States were largely responsible for.
Yeah, I'm always impressed when I come across visionaries in history books because I'm like, there's no way I could have seen that far down the road. So people like that always impress me. But when I got to that part of your book, it reminded me of a modified saying. The law is like the military. It's not a broadsword. It's a scalpel. And you just punish those who did something wrong and not just blanket charge everybody of a crime. And so FDR and others certainly get credit for wanting to do that, even though the American bloodlust is quite high after they announce all the information about the Doolittle Raiders. But I did want to. So there are still some American POWs. They're not being treated very well. They're losing weight, and I don't think I truly appreciated what solitary confinement did to a human being until I read your book. I mean, that is an incredible form of torture. It doesn't matter that they're not being hit, but they're just left with their own thoughts, and I don't think I truly appreciated what they're going through. And you can certainly speak to that if you'd like to. But I want to skip some stuff because I want to save it for the readers, because kind of the transition from this point, say, April of 1943 until the end of the war is absolutely incredible in your book. But if you want to talk about the solitary confinement, please do. But then I was going to ask you to maybe jump ahead and talk about Operation Magpie.
Yeah. So, right, as you said, the solitary confinement is probably the most brutal of the tortures, and that's very counterintuitive for a lot of people. But John McCain, if you've ever read Faith of My Fathers, talks about it quite eloquently. He was obviously subject to some pretty brutal torture. His arms he could never raise his arms above his head again. By the North Vietnamese. But he described the solitary confinement as the worst part of his captivity. That it really just breaks. Yeah, it is. It breaks a man down. But yeah, Operation Magpie is a great. It's a great sort of piece of this story. The Office of Strategic Services, most people know, forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency. After the bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before the war is technically over on August 15th, gets the word that they're to change their commando missions in China. To rescue missions. And so each of these operations gets the name of a bird, and Operation Magpie is dedicated to liberating the Feng Tai prisoner of war camp, which is on the outskirts of Beijing. And they don't, and let me just say, no one knows the Doolittle Raiders are alive at this point. Everyone assumes they're dead, right? They're dead. If they're dead in a movie, they're dead, right?
Yes,
that's sort of the traditional American way of thinking about it. If Hollywood says they're dead, they're dead. But they go to this prisoner of war camp, and it's like 2 or 3 days, if I'm remembering correctly, after the surrender of Hirohito's surrender on August 15th, and they drop into this field outside of Feng Tai and are slowly approaching. It's late afternoon. They're slowly approaching this prison camp. It's a team of just 6 guys, 6 commandos, and all of a sudden some pops start going off, and they start taking fire from the prison camp. And they hit the dirt, and ultimately this lieutenant comes out and rounds them all up, and basically, and they find out within a few minutes, none of the Japanese soldiers know that the war is over. Only the officers know. And they're like, look, had you guys come at night, you would be dead.
Yes.
Because we would be, the officers would be in bed, and these guys would have just shot you.
Oh, my God.
So they survived. They survived this initial altercation with the Japanese outside the prison camp. And then through negotiation, to some extent, the help of the Swiss legation as well, liberate 500 Allied prisoners of war in the Feng Tai prisoner camp. And put them up at this repurposed geisha house, this posh hotel in Beijing, where all these prisoners of war, their first good meal in 5 years. They're pilfering all the sake and the beer from the refrigerators, and just this revelry, this celebration of not only victory but liberation. And while this is all going on, the lead of the commando unit, this guy Ray Nichols. Here's a rumor that the Doolittle Raiders were in Feng Tai. None of the guys in the Grand Hotel de Wagon Li, which is this hotel in Beijing, were Doolittle Raiders. And so he gets in the face of the prison warden at Feng Tai. I know the Doolittle Raiders are here. Don't you lie to me. And sure enough, the prison warden goes to a secret part of the prison where they've been holding the Doolittle Raiders and brings them out. And one of them is unable to move. One of them, they believe, is actually dead, a guy named George. But the other 3 are brought out, are shaved quickly. They're put in oversized uniforms and led out in front of the camp. And Nichols reaches over to one, and it's Chase Nielsen. And he says, "Who are you?" And he's like, "My name's Chase Nielsen. I'm a Doolittle Raider." And Ray Nichols sort of like has a wry smile as the story is told. He gets this wry smile, and he's like, "Watch out for this guy. He's off his rocker," because everyone thinks the Doolittle Raiders are dead. But sure enough, there they are. Wow. Lazarus is back from the dead.
Right.
The Doolittle Raid couple, Chase Nielsen, along with two of the other Doolittle Raiders, get their own couple days in the Grand Hotel de Wagon Lee to celebrate before they're taken to Chungking, which is the main air base and the main U.S. air base at the time, where they're interviewed for the first time by war crimes investigators, and that's kind of one of the jumping off points for the broader story that my book tells, as you know.
Right.
And then ultimately finally make their way home.
So again, I want to skip some stuff in the book. So they've rescued the prisoners, the Doolittle Raiders, and obviously there has to be a trial because the Americans have to figure out what's happened to these people. And when they do question them, there's some horrendous, like you were mentioning earlier, some horrendous actions taken against these Americans. But if you could for us, because this is the part of the book, for people who like legal thrillers, this is the part of the book, I don't want to ruin it for you. But if you could give us a sense of some of the American prosecutors, who was actually being charged of the Japanese and the defense counsel. And the part of your story that I really enjoyed was the defense counsel, Americans, they weren't just going to lay there and take it. They actually they were very active in defending these Japanese soldiers. And it almost, looks for a while that they're going to carry the day because they take their charge very seriously.
Yeah, so this is the meat of the book, as I think you described it to me. This is a legal thriller set in World War II, and the point of departure from the sort of traditional Doolittle Raid stories, which are fabulous, like we've just been talking about, right. and where this book is new ground and finds a lot of stuff that has never been written about before, is the search for justice for the Doolittle Raiders. Mm-hmm. And that primarily fell to a 40-year-old Army captain who got drafted in 1942 into the Army from Rochester, New York, by the name of Robert Dwyer.
Right.
And to say that most of his experience during the war was mind-numbingly boring would be an understatement.
Right.
But nevertheless, he's redeployed to Shanghai. He works in the 14th Air Force's legal department, and he gets the file on the Doolittle Raiders, including these, their first reports from August when they're first liberated. They sit down for a lengthy interview with a guy named Ham Young, who's the head of the legal department for all of the Army in China. Mm-hmm. And he sits down with this, the report of this interview, and what a lot of the book tries to recount is what a struggle that actually is. Mm-hmm. Because you can't find people who've been involved, right? Roosevelt personally promises in 1943, when this is all revealed, responsible will be held individually accountable for what happened. Right. But Dwyer is now presented with a really challenging question of who's really responsible, right? Who is responsible? Because you could say the emperor's responsible. You could say, all the little, grunts and soldiers who held them as prison guards are responsible, right? It runs the full gamut. You can't put, 100, 200, 300 people on trial, right. Even if they're all in some way responsible. And so what he ultimately hits upon is the idea that, the worst of what happened to the Doolittle Raiders, their murder, their torture, all revolve around this trial in 1942, this show trial. Mm-hmm. And, not only does this trial, lead to their executions, but it ends up laundering this evidence that's tortured out of them, right? It justifies their torture in some way.
Right.
And he realizes that the perversion of justice that the Japanese engaged in is essentially what is those who engaged in that perverted justice are those who are really most responsible. Mm-hmm. And so he just, again, incredible, right? There's no roadmap for how to do this in 1945, 1946 when he's putting this case together.
Right. He
identifies the Japanese judges and lawyers as well as the head of the execution party and the Japanese general who's responsible for the whole trial. He puts them on trial. And so what you end up having in 1946 is the trial of a trial, right? Did the Japanese pervert justice essentially as a way of doing the paperwork for torture and murder? And it's this just utterly stunning, brilliant innovation in the law, this idea that someone can be responsible for torture pouring the water from the water board or sticking the pencils into someone's fingers. That their complicity in some ways is far more profound because they were doing it with paperwork. They were doing it with the patina of legality. And so that's just this amazing part of the story, that unpacking how he does that is just, and he runs himself totally ragged, right? He goes all over Asia. He travels maybe not 10,000, but thousands of miles in these very slow 1945 airplanes, trying to figure out how to put this case together.
Right.
And this is ultimately what he settles upon. And then on the defense side, as you say, it's almost just as compelling of a story. It's such an interesting story because the lead defense lawyer is not a lawyer. He's a decorated pilot who flies liaison flights all over China.
Right.
Gets the Silver Star.
Wow.
Right. And he's in Shanghai with the 14th Air Force after the war. They're getting ready to send him home because they don't need combat pilots in Shanghai anymore.
Right.
And he, unfortunately, for his career's sake, falls in love with a beautiful Russian woman who lives in Shanghai, who's the concierge at the Broadway Mansions, which is a hotel that is repurposed to be the officers' quarters in Shanghai in 1945, 1946. And he needs a reason to stay in Shanghai on the Army's dime.
Right.
And so he solves the problem because no one wants to represent the Japanese responsible for the murder and torture and execution of the Doolittle Raiders. And so he's given the case, right? This is his way. This is his ticket. So he's doing it for all the wrong reasons. And certainly when he starts, and he's not qualified even a little bit. He had done a little night school at law school,
right.
but he had no qualifications to do this. And I think initially he certainly expects what everyone else expects, that there's going to be a trial. It's going to look fine. It's going to be a little more fair, certainly, it's going to be more fair than what the Japanese did. But this is, everyone knows the outcome, right? This is not that different,
right?
From what we were accusing the Japanese of, right? There's this, everyone wants to see and everyone expects to see these Japanese men executed.
Oh, yes.
But Bodine, for a combination of reasons that I won't spoil, ultimately decides that it's his job to do it right. It's his job as the defense lawyer to ensure that they get a fair trial. And that's what he does. It's incredible, right? It's an incredible, moral choice, an incredibly difficult moral choice. Essentially ends his Air Force career because he just can't just stand there as a smartly uniformed potted plant while, injustice takes place. He's like, I have to fight. It's these men have put their lives in my hands. I have to fight for them, even though they're my enemies. Even though, had I joined the Air Force 1 year earlier, I could have been a Doolittle Raider and executed. Right, I could be the victim in this case instead of the defense. And so his transformation was just so fascinating to write about, and how he ultimately decides to put on a fair trial, and the fact that. This was a fair trial is, a real testament. That was the victory in a way that despite all the pressures to engage in the same kind of, expeditious justice that the Japanese engaged in, that we actually conducted a fair trial, that we resisted the impulse for revenge, even when we had all the power in the world to exact revenge without any limit or consequence. And that's why I just found, the story just kind of heartwarming. I know that's a strange way to describe a World War II story in some ways. But you have these two men facing off, Robert Dwyer for the prosecution, Edmund Bodine for the defense, men of good faith, conscience, trying to do the right thing and competing over what the right thing is, and ultimately, I think I'll let people judge for themselves, but ultimately trying to and succeeding in reaching an outcome that makes the world more just than it had been before they started. And so it's in times like ours, which can be pretty dark and cynical. I actually found writing this book very uplifting in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. This was one of the moments of the book that I had renewed my faith in the human spirit, because you're right, they could have easily gone down the road of revenge, and everybody was expecting them to, and it would have served the defense well if they had just rolled over and given up, and they could have benefited from that. But they took their job very seriously, and the idea of fair play which I think it's not uniquely American, but we certainly take that seriously in our country and our culture. And so they did the best defense they could, which is going to give everybody an unexpected ending. So we're not going to ruin that for everybody. But in the absence of, well, let me put it this way. I know we're running a little long, and I certainly appreciate your time, but I have to ask you, based on your travels and your experience and your research, would it be fair to say that the Japanese in general have come to grips with the atrocities that their soldiers committed during the war? Because I know that they don't have a military today, and I don't even think they want a military today. But as far as facing what transpired during the war, would you say that they acknowledge that readily?
It probably depends on who you ask, right?
Uh-huh.
Like Japan, like America, is a really complicated society with
Sure.
people of different levels of education and political persuasion and ideology and personal connections to various historical events. So,
Right.
if you go, so I did a lot of my research at the Yasukuni Shrine, which is Japan's longstanding shrine to the war dead, going back, hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
But World War II is included there. And I think anyone who goes, certainly an American who goes to the Yasukuni Shrine and the Yasukuni Shrine Museum is taken aback,
Right.
right? Like you walk into the museum and there's a zero hanging from the ceiling.
Wow.
Right? The perspective on the Second World War is entirely different than anything you'll see in the United States, and in a lot of very obviously glossy, rosy-eyed kind of ways that are don't reckon with Japan's more sinister, the more sinister parts of Japan's wartime history.
Right.
And so on that side, right, there are people who sort of deliberately refuse to reckon with history. But I think Japan more generally, again, it's a complex society, so I never would speak, for the Japanese generally.
Sure.
But I think Japan has actually internalized some of the real hard lessons of the war in ways that even countries like Germany haven't, right? Germany, I think, has done a much better job, certainly, of making the reckoning with its own history of atrocities, things like the Holocaust, part of its cultural DNA, right? And that's part of the education system in Germany. It's not really part of the education system in Japan the same way, not. However, as you said, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which we forced them to adopt in 1946, but forbids Japan from waging war, forbids them from having a standing army except for defensive purposes. And it's every so often politically controversial. In fact, the United States has often been the one pushing Japan to build more of a military because, we wanted their help initially in the Korean War. Now as a counterweight militarily to China, that's part of the U.S. strategic posture.
Right.
But Japan itself has largely adopted has fully embraced Article 9, right? They did a poll earlier this year of public support for Article 9 in Japan. The Japan Times did it, and it was 69%, right? So you have 69% of the Japanese population saying we want nothing to do with foreign war, right? We want nothing to do with foreign adventurism, the kind of militarism that defined, our policy in the middle of the 20th century. And that's a really remarkable thing to have that kind of level of, I think the only thing you can really call it is a kind of pacifism, part of the cultural DNA. And so for the Japanese, I think, to step back and how broadly speaking is World War II remembered? I think it's much more remembered for the suffering than it is for any triumph or valor or vainglory. They suffered, obviously, the atomic bombings. The fire bombings were far more significant in many ways than the atomic bombings were. And that's the cultural memory of war in Japan, not the triumphalist, foreign adventurism. There's very little of it. There is an element of that, of course. It's a complex society. But they really do see their wartime experience as a chastening lesson, which is why something like Article 9 is as popular as it is.
Right. I think that speaks volumes to where they're at as a people. So that's a very good point. I do want to thank you, Mr. Paradis, for your time in this book. And for the listeners out there, please note that we have left massive amounts of information out. Certainly in the legal aspect, we have just barely graced the surface. And just to let you also know as well, because I'm a big fan of audiobooks, the gentleman that read your book, I'm sorry I don't have his name right now, but he did an
Roy.
Thank
Jacques
you.
Roy. Yeah,
He did a great job reading the book, the pitch, the timing, the presentation. So the audiobook was I almost walked my dog into retirement. He doesn't want to see me anymore, but he did a great job. But I just have to say before we go that I'm probably like most Americans. There was the Doolittle Raiders. Some of them got away. Some of them were captured. We gave Japan a black eye, and a lot of them came home eventually. That's pretty much all I knew. I had no idea about the other side of the story, so I certainly wanted to thank you for that. I'm sure it was a labor of love for you, but I'm sure it took a very long time and a lot of research to do it. But as far as you're concerned, can I ask what was your biggest takeaway from this whole process, whether it's historical, whether it's legal, as far as all of these events that you uncovered? What did you what impressed you the most?
Certainly the courage of the Doolittle Raiders, the courage of the American lawyers, both Robert Dwyer and Edmund Bodine, just the moral courage and the stick-to-itiveness that they showed under incredible political pressure. So the courage of some of the Japanese. I know that's a controversial thing to say, but I mean, unpacking Japan's history around this was interesting. It was just interesting to see that there were Japanese people who were fighting the good fight from within, even though they didn't succeed, and that needs to be recognized. So those were sort of like some of the more heartening takeaways. I think probably I risk leaving on a down note, but I think one of the more disturbing takeaways that was, again, primarily based on my research on sort of the Japanese perspective on all of this, is that Japan was not Germany. Japan did horrible things throughout the war, and you only need to look at the rape of Nanking or the Bataan Death March to get proof of that, or the Battle of Manila. Right. You name it, right? But unlike Nazi Germany, unlike fascist Italy, atrocities were not the policy of the government, right? It was not a centralized system. It wasn't a country led by monsters. Instead, it was a country of people who really thought they were incapable of doing bad things. And that was a really, frankly, disturbing and chastening insight to have, is that you can have a country of good people who do bad things for seemingly good reasons, and you can have bad people who do good things for seemingly bad reasons, and that there's a moral complexity to the Pacific War that I think I certainly had no real appreciation of, and I think it offers at least an opportunity to reflect on the importance of people standing up. Like all the things that I said are really great that people I admire in this book. That heroism really needs to be held up and celebrated, because it's very easy, even for well-meaning people, even for countries who think they're on the side of truth and justice, right? The Japanese didn't believe the Japanese public, I should say, through propaganda, certainly didn't believe they were engaging in torture. It was a deep taboo to use torture in Japan, yet they were. And it ultimately just takes good people actually standing up for the values they claim to care about, not just assuming that everything we're going to be doing is always, on the side of right and goodness. And that's just shows the real heroism of people like Jimmy Doolittle's, people like the lawyers I write about in this book, who put their bodies on the line to stand up for what they care about, for what's important. And so, and it's a sort of it's a warning, or at least a signal to all of us that it's our job to carry that forward, right? The values we claim to stand up for don't stand up for themselves. We have to do it. And so, I apologize if that's a slightly darker note to end on. But it was certainly one of the heavier takeaways that I had in the process of writing the book.
Sure. No, absolutely well said. And as far as the very first part of your answer, I think we all agree that America could use some more moral courage in the face of political pressure. Just because something's expedient doesn't mean it's the best answer. So no, I like that very much. And for all the listeners out there, again, the book is Last Mission to Tokyo, the extraordinary story of the Doolittle Raiders and their final fight for justice. Michel Paradis, thank you very much for this book, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.